committee stages, but I commend the bill as it stands to the House.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, I rise to take a call on the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill to reiterate the comments made by my colleague David Parker that Labor supports this bill. It supports the ratification of the changes to the Articles of Agreement. It does not, however, support the change that would allow future updates to the Articles to be made by regulation. The reason for that is quite simple, that our commitments to the IMF and its special drawing rights are very substantial in terms of their fiscal implications, and this is a core part of the international financial institutional structure, and it requires the consideration of this House should significant changes be made to its Articles of Agreement. Mr Speaker, having noted those formalities, I wish to concentrate the bulk of my remarks on the contribution to economic debate currently being sponsored by the IMF, because the IMF has become a voice of reason at a time of great turmoil in international economic debate. Now, members will know that the former Director General Dominique Strauss-Kahn had quite a reputation, and he had quite a reputation for a number of things. But one of the best things, perhaps the best thing that he had a reputation for, was for thinking a little differently about some of the dogmas of economics that had been the hallmark of the IMF for decades until his tenure. Now, that may have ruffled a few feathers. Who knows, it may even have contributed to his downfall. But let us not ignore the huge change in what the world's probably leading classic financial institution has been telling us. 4 years since the mid-1970s and the oil shocks and the rise of neoliberalism, the International Monetary Fund was a champion of monetarism, of light-handed regulation, of fiscal rectitude, of balanced budgets, and of a very, very conservative style of economic management. It represented par excellence the economic orthodoxies of the 70s, 80s and 90s. It was the gold standard for conservative economics. It was famous for imposing its view of the world on struggling third world countries, forcing, for example, massive fiscal consolidations, massive cuts to state sectors, massive layoffs, massive economic contractions in order to achieve fiscal targets. Russian oligarchs spring to mind, Central American banana republics crashing and burning, to name a few. Times have changed. The old orthodoxies, the Washington Consensus, has been swept away by a little something that the national government doesn't seem to have noticed, unless they want an excuse, and that's called the global financial crisis. One of the things that it swept away was the so-called Washington Consensus on monetary policy. The idea that the only thing that mattered, and it may have made sense immediately post the oil shocks of the 70s, was price stability, the control of inflation. That somehow price stability, according to the then IMF, equalled financial stability, and that financial stability equalled economic stability, and economic stability equalled social stability. All, if you controlled inflation, the rest would take care of itself, said Milton Friedman and his Chicago school acolytes. And then 2008, the immense asset bubble built up by shonky real estate loans, magnified 100-fold or 1,000-fold by derivatives like collateralized debt obligations and other things that were supposed to spread risk but actually magnified it. And all of the orthodoxies about lowering interest rates that Mr Bernanke and Mr Greenspan had been following in the US were swept away. And the IMF, to its credit, had the courage to say, we were wrong. We were wrong. There's an old saying that only a fool when confronted by new information, refuses to change their mind. And to IMF's credit, it did. And Mr. Strauss-Kahn deserves some credit, as does his successor, Christine Lagarde, for having the courage to say times have changed. What does it mean for us? Well, isn't it interesting? New Zealand, and this shared history between both sides of the House, was the poster child for the IMF prescription of the 80s. Rogernomics, and then the Shiraz full-bodied version, Ruth Richardson, was the most extreme and pure form of neoclassical economics and neoliberal politics almost anywhere in the world. It was IMF textbook. And where are we now? And then Don Brash, who was the ultra-orthodox governor of the Reserve Bank, took over the National Party. And they've never recovered. And then ACT. And while the doyens of this worldview have moved further to the right across the New Zealand political spectrum, so I think Don Brash flirted with Labour youth when he was a pimply teenager or something. No, I'm sorry, but you know, some people dry out so far that it becomes almost laughable. But the point is this, and it's a very serious point, that what was once absolutely mainstream has now been stranded like a fish on a receding riverbank, flapping around, gasping for air. That is what is left of the monetarist consensus. And almost the only people who still believe in it are the New Zealand National Party and the ACT Party. The IMF doesn't believe it. Olivier Blanchard, their chief economist, who my colleague Mr. Park has just been to visit, he doesn't believe it. He's just co-authored a book about why it no longer applies. And there is nothing that is required, and there is nothing, and it builds on a whole lot of other literature, including Kahneman and Tversky and Rogoff and Reinhardt. This time is different. A history of 300 years of financial crises. This time is different, they said. And every time a bubble bursts and a society takes a decade to work its way out of the heap of bad debt. And in those circumstances, institutions like the IMF become very important. What has the IMF said of New Zealand? What advice have we received from the IMF? Well, let's just note. Firstly, let's take their take. My colleague, Mr. Park, is getting rightly excited by this because, you know, we part-time economists, we think this is pretty juicy stuff. Let's first note what they've said is wrong. Is it our huge public debt? No. Do they think we have a public debt problem? No. Why? Because our public debt is less than a quarter of the OECD average. We do not, by relative terms, have a significant public debt problem. That doesn't mean we don't want value for money. We do. But the issue is not that. The issue, according to the IMF, is that we have two key problems. A lack of private savings and too much private debt, and an under-diversified, commodity-driven, low-value export profile that's getting the country further and further behind the card. And what is the national government doing about those two key problems? Nothing. Would they support strong savings policy that would build our savings up? Would they support capital gains tax that would help us to save in real assets? No. Would they support monetary reform that would help our exporters close the current account deficit? No. Would they take any of the advice of the International Monetary Fund about how to fix the New Zealand economy? No. Why are they then paying the bill? If they're not listening to the doctor, why are they paying the tab? Why are we here, Mr. Speaker, saying that we agree to pay the tab when the New Zealand government is not listening to the answer? The answer is clear. New Zealand needs a change of direction. The old orthodoxies are not working. But don't take the Labour opposition's word for it. Talk to the Spring Creek miners. Talk to the guys laid off in Newplex this week. Talk to the guys and girls laid off at TY Point or Norske Skog. Talk to the people all around the country whose livelihoods are driving up and whose children are in the departure gates. And then ask yourself, isn't it time we listened to the IMF?
Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak on the international finance